privilege to speak to what I believe to be the future of the church. And some of you here are the future leaders of the church. And with a strong calling of God in your life, and you know it. You know it. You probably know it for a while, that God has a strong call in your life. And you're here trying to better yourself to fulfill the call that God has given you. So, because of that, I'm really excited. And I want to speak to you very quickly about something that is dear to my heart. If you are the leaders that are going to lead the church into the future, one of the things that you are going to be facing is how does the church engage what we call now stigmas that we are now dealing with. Certain kinds of stigmas. How do we do this well? How do we present the gospel in a way that reach those that need the most, but those are the ones that typically are ostracized and are on the sidelines? And I could sit here and try to come up with great strategies for you to do that, or we could just listen and see, how did Jesus do that? Did he face situations where he had to go outside of what was normal for a religious group to do? Did he have to do that? And how did he do that? Because I think that what Jesus did back then, it's still what he asks us to do today. And there is no better story to identify those things than the story of the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman. How many of you guys read that story and know it by heart? Good. So I'm not going to read through the story. I'm going to assume you have read John chapter 4 and you know the story. And we're just going to mention here and there parts of these verses for time's sake. But there are, in this story, Jesus is confronted with 4 different types of stigmas. And the gospel responds to those stigmas with interesting responses and ideas. And the church is faced with the same kinds of stigmas. The first one is a racial stigma. The first is a social or racial stigma. The woman that Jesus meets, she is a Samaritan. Jesus was a Jew. And Samaritans were considered to be half-breed by the Jewish people. Do you know what the nickname, anybody knows what was the nickname that the Jewish people would give to Samaritans? Anybody? They would call them dogs. Have you ever heard the story of Jesus saying, well, you don't take from the plates of the family and give to the dogs? Jesus was just talking to a woman that understood that they were being called. That was the nickname that the Jewish people had for Samaritan people. They were dogs. And the reason is because they were the leftover, the northern tribes who got together with the Syrians and broke God's law by intermixing. And now the result of it, they were half-breeds. They were dogs in the eyes of Samaritans. The most religious Jewish people would consider themselves unclean if the shadow of a Samaritan person would touch their shadow. They will consider themselves unclean. Now you know the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Anybody knows that story? I think we know the story by heart. And we find in that story that a man leaves Jerusalem, goes to Jericho, and on the way he's beaten, he's robbed, and he's left for death. That Jewish man, when Jesus is speaking about the story, the people that were listening to the story, they understood that there were 2 very different ways to go from Jerusalem to Jericho. One of them was a safer way, a well-traveled way, but it went through Samaria. And the second one was used by those that wanted to avoid going to Samaria. And it took them around bends and around hills and was a dangerous kind of trip. So the Jewish man now comes in contact with danger because he's trying to avoid being in contact with Samaritans. So the first stigma that Jesus encounters in this story is this racial stigma. The Jewish people didn't believe that the Samaritans were worthy of God's salvation, that they are worthy of anything that God had to offer them. So they would avoid them because they were sinners. How did Jesus respond? And how does the gospel respond today to situations like that, where we look at certain races of people and we say, hey, it's their fault they're the way they are. If they only did things the way we did, if they only behaved the way we behaved, it's their fault. How does the church respond? How does the gospel respond? Well, the same way that Jesus did. The first thing that Jesus did is that he realized that for Samaritans to be reached, there needed to be a presence in Samaria. The Bible clearly tells us, I believe in verse 4, chapter 4 of the book of John, that Jesus had to go through Samaria. He had to. There was an intentionality in a part of Jesus. Not that this is geographically where he was going, that he could bypass it, but he had to. There was this intentionality to be there, to be present. How do we reach those who we look at and we say, well, those in the margin of societies? We reach them by putting a presence of the gospel. Jesus shows up. He's there. The Samaritan woman decides that she's going to gather water at noon because she doesn't want to mix with people, because she has all of these other problems in her life. And lo and behold, when she thinks she's alone, there is a presence. Jesus shows up. And if we are to be the church that reaches out to those that need the most, if you are to be the leaders of the church of tomorrow that are going to bring the gospel where it's most needed, the gospel needs to be present where it's most needed. So we pack up for our comfortable homes. We pack up for our comfortable way of life. And we move in among those that need the most. I pastored and planted Christian Family Center in Elton. And right where we planted the church, it's a huge pocket of poverty. Lots of First Nation, lots of new immigration, lots of people that are trying to struggle through life, lots of single parents, lots of children that are going without food to school. And when we began to feel called to that place, the first thing we did is that we said to our family, we're going to move right there. I still live in Elton. I still live right in the same home, in the same place. My wife works at the school just down the road from us. We started a breakfast program right in that school that started with 2 days a week. Now it's 5 days a week. Then some other school called us and said, if you're doing that, can you do it here too? So now the church, even though a small church, is a poor church, is doing breakfast programs 5 days a week in 2 different schools, feeding over 100 kids every single morning. Why? Because if the gospel is going to reach those who are at the margin of society, it requires a presence. Second, the gospel requires contextualization. Jesus said, when at the well with the woman, what did Jesus speak about? When he was at the well with the woman, what did he talk about? He talked about water. Can you give me something to drink? He didn't go started saying, hey, you're married, you've been married so many times, and you have all of these things, and all of these things are wrong with you. No, there was a context that he was presented with, and the gospel fit with that context. He began to talk about water. Look, I need water. You have the means to give me water. Give me water. And that clear conversation led to this transformation in the life of the woman. Sometimes we come with an idea that the gospel has to be presented this way and this way only, and that's the way we're going to do it, and we're going to bring it in every single context that we go to. That's how we're going to present the gospel. But what if we allow the Spirit to lead us in a moment and allow the Spirit to teach us how to contextualize the gospel to the situation that we're in? Notice, the gospel wasn't changed, but it was definitely contextualized.